Hi, I'm Rashonda Cade, and this is Reading with Rashonda. We are still reading William Wells Brown's Clotel, and we finished off last time in Chapter 11. That ended with the minstrel song that we were talking about and talking about minstrelsy. So here we are with Chapter 12, A Night in the Parson's Kitchen. And see the servants met their daily labors o'er, and with the jest and song they set the kitchen in a roar. Mr. Peck kept around him 4 servants besides Kerr, of whom we have made mention. Of these, Sam was considered the first. If a dinner party was in contemplation, or any company to be invited to the parson's, after all the arrangements had been talked over by the minister and his daughter, Sam was sure to be consulted upon the subject by Miss Georgie, as Miss Peck was called by the servants. If furniture, crockery, or anything else was to be purchased, Sam felt that he had been slighted if his opinion had not been asked. As to the marketing, he did it all. At the servants' table in the kitchen, he sat at the head and was master of ceremonies. A single look from him was enough to silence any conversation or noise in the kitchen or any other part of the premises. There is, in the southern states, a great amount of prejudice against color amongst the Negroes themselves. The nearer the Negro or mulatto approaches to the white, the more he seems to feel his superiority over those of darker hue. This is no doubt the result of the prejudice that exists on the part of the whites toward both mulattoes and blacks. Sam was originally from Kentucky, and through the instrumentality of one of his young masters whom he had to take to school, he had learned to read as well as to be understood, and owing to that fact was considered a prodigy among the slaves, not only of his own masters, but those of the town who knew him. Sam had a great wish to follow in the footsteps of his master and be a poet, and was therefore often heard singing doggerels of his own composition. But there was one great drawback to Sam, and that was his color. He was one of the blackest of his race. This he evidently regarded as a great misfortune. However, he made up for this in his dress. Mr. Peck kept his house servants well dressed, and as for Sam, he was seldom seen except in a ruffled shirt. Indeed, the washerwoman feared him more than all the others about the house. Okay, so we ended chapter 11 with a minstrel song, blackface minstrelsy. Around the time of the writing of this novel, it was written in 1853, and in the early 1850s, blackface minstrelsy was the most popular form of entertainment in the U.S., and it was when white men specifically, would put on blackface makeup. So they would take coal and blacken their faces. You've probably seen the pictures. They would have like big outline, mostly red lips, and like white around their eyes. Bugs Bunny cartoons used to have a lot of blackface in them. So we ended chapter 11 with a minstrel song. And so at Blackface Minstrel Productions, they would sing and dance, and they would really just mock what black people were doing. And it was like mocking black people trying to be like white people. So it was white men in blackface mocking black people, often as they were trying to do what white people were doing. It was this whole complicated mess, really. But so we ended chapter 11 with a minstrel song, and here we are in chapter 12 with what's his name? His name is Sam. Sam is, how was it termed? But there was one great drawback to Sam, and that was his color. He was one of the blackest of his race. Sam looks like a minstrel character. So if you think of a minstrel show with white people blackening their faces with coal, they clearly look darker than most black people would, right? Like, I'm a black person. I'm a light-skinned black person, admittedly, but like, I'm not as dark as coal would be. But Sam here is painted to be as dark as coal. So we have a slave who is really, really dark-skinned, but who also knows how to read and speaks well. And Sam had a great wish to follow in the footsteps of his master and be a poet. And that was the minstrel song that we just heard. And they called, Brown called Sam Master of Ceremonies, and he dressed in ruffled shirts. So what we have here is a minstrel show happening right before our eyes. Sam is just a minstrel character meant to lampoon the black people as a white take on blackness. So let's keep our eyes on that. I know I got like all worked up because I get excited by this kind of stuff. I don't know why. We all like what we like. But so we are watching a minstrel show go down in the character of Sam, and Brown set it up so beautifully by giving us a minstrel song the chapter before. And here Brown also talked about mulattoes. Mulattoes are mixed race people. Typically in 19th century novels, a mulatto was a person who had one white parent and one black parent. But the term can be used for anybody who is mixed race, most often with white and black. We get into other terms like quadroon. That's a person who has one white parent and one mulatto parent. An octoroon is a person who has one quadroon parent and one white parent. And by that point, the person really looks white. And that's really where we are with Althesa and Clotel. They are people who really look white. In this setup, they're quadroons. So that's where we are. We've got a whole lot. You have to picture people's complexions as you think about this novel, because that makes all of the difference. I know, I'm all excited. All right, let's keep reading. Kerr, as we have already stated, was chief of the kitchen department and had a general supervision of the household affairs. Alfred the coachman, Peter, and Hetty made up the remainder of the house servants. Besides these, Mr. Peck owned 8 slaves who were masons. The slaves who worked in the house were called servants. The slaves who worked outside of the house were called slaves. Interesting. These worked in the city. Being mechanics, they were left out to greater advantage than to keep them on the farm. However, every Sunday night, Peck's servants, including the bricklayers, usually assembled in the kitchen when the events of the week were freely discussed and commented on. It was on a Sunday evening in the month of June that there was a party at Mr. Peck's, and according to the custom in the southern states, the ladies had their maidservants with them. Tea had been served in the house, and the servants, including the strangers, had taken their seats at the tea table in the kitchen. Sam, being a single gentleman, was unusually attentive to the ladies on this occasion. He seldom or ever let the day pass without spending at least an hour in combing and brushing up his hair. Sam had an idea that fresh butter was better for his hair than any other kind of grease, and therefore on churning days, half a pound of butter had always to be taken out before it was salted. Okay, so we have Sam, who's a black man, a very dark-skinned black man, who is probably the star of a minstrel show. And minstrel shows were funny, and they were entertaining to the white audiences that enjoyed them. So imagine being at a minstrel show and watching somebody slather up their hair with fresh butter. This is intended to hearken to minstrelsy and for certain readers to be hilarious. When he wished to appear to great advantage, he would grease his face to make it shiny. So now his face is all greased up. He's got a shiny face. His hair's got butter in it. I bet in a minute he's going to be laughing and singing and yucking it up. Let's see. On the evening of the party, therefore, when all the servants were at the table, Sam cut a big figure. There he sat with his wool well combed and buttered, face nicely greased, and his ruffles extending 5 or 6 inches from his breast. Oh my gosh, picture it. He's got a ruffle shirt with ruffles out to here. His face is greased up. He's got butter in his hair. Oh my gosh. The parson in his own drawing room did not make a more imposing appearance than did his servant on this occasion. "I just been had my fortune told last Sunday night," said Sam as he helped one of the girls to some sweet hash. "Indeed!" cried a half a dozen voices. "Yes," continued he, "Aunt Winnie told me I is to have the prettiest yaller gal in town and that I is to be free." Imagine if you were a white audience in a minstrel show in 1853. This would be really hilarious for you to watch. This dark person talking about, "I'm gonna get me a yellow girl and I'm gonna be free," while wearing a ridiculous outfit with a shiny face and butter in your hair. All right. All eyes were immediately turned towards Sally Johnson, who was seated near Sam. "I spec I see somebody blush at that remark," said Alfred. "Pass them pancakes and molasses up this way, Mr. Alf, and none of your insinuation here," rejoined Sam. "That reminds me," said Currer, "that Dorcas Simpson is going to get married." "Who to? I want to know," inquired Peter. "To one of Mr. Darby's field hands," answered Currer. "I should think that gal would not throw herself away in that manner," said Sally. "She good enough looking to get a house servant and not put up with a field nigger," continued she. "Yes," said Sam, "that's a wery insensible remark of yours, Miss Sally. I admire your judgment very much, I assure you. There's plenty of susceptible and well-dressed house servants that a gal of her looks can get without taking up with them common darkies." "Is the man black or a mulatto?" inquired one of the company. "He's nearly white," replied Currer. "Well, then that's some excuse for her," remarked Sam, "for I don't like to see this amalgamation of blacks and mulattoes nohow," continued Sam. "If I had my rights, I would be a mulatto too, for my mother was almost as light-skinned as Miss Sally," said he. Although Sam was one of the blackest men living, he nevertheless contended that his mother was a mulatto, and no one was more prejudiced against the blacks than he. All right, so let's continue to imagine our minstrel show. Now, we said minstrelsy often was white men in blackface acting as black people who were acting like white people. And we have that right here. It's a whole conversation about who's getting married to whom, who is good enough for whom. And in the state of slavery, slaves didn't have the freedom to get married, and certainly not to who they wanted to. That was all determined for them. It was preposterous, really, for them to be having conversations about who was going to marry whom and who was good enough for whom. And then on top of that, that the conversation centered around complexion. Oh, she is way too light-skinned for a field hand because field hands are supposed to be dark-skinned. But this field hand got a pass because he's nearly white. And our friend Sam is like, "I may have the blackest skin anybody's ever seen, but ideologically, I'm a mulatto. So I should be with the light-skinned people." Not only is this a lampoon of a minstrel show, it's an indictment against the colorism in the black community as well. Let's continue. A good deal of work and the free use of fresh butter had no doubt done wonders for his hair in causing it to grow long, and to this he would always appeal when he wished to convince others that he was part of an Anglo-Saxon. "I always thought you was not clear black, Mr. Sam," said Agnes. "You are right there, Miss Agnes. My hair tells what company I belong to," answered Sam. Here the whole company joined in the conversation about color, which lasted for some time, giving unmistakable evidence that caste is owing to ignorance. The evening's entertainment concluded by Sam's relating a little of his own experience while with his first master in Old Kentucky. Sam's former master was a doctor and had a large practice among his neighbors, doctoring both masters and slaves. When Sam was about 15 years of age, his old master set him to grinding up the ointment, then to making pills. As the young student grew older and became more practiced in his profession, his services were of more importance to the doctor. The physician having a good business and a large number of his patients being slaves, the most of whom had to call on the doctor when ill, he put Sam to bleeding, pulling teeth, and administering medicine to the slaves. Sam soon acquired the name amongst the slaves of the Black Doctor. With this appellation, he was delighted, and no regular physician could possibly have put on more airs than did the black doctor when his services were required. In bleeding, he must have more bandages and rub and smack the arm more than the doctor would have thought of. We once saw Sam taking out a tooth for one of his patients, and nothing appeared more amusing. I told you he was going to be shucking and jiving in a minute. He's acting like a doctor, putting on airs, slapping people around, doing who knows what when he's pulling out teeth. Blackface minstrelsy happening here on the pages of William Wells Brown's novel. He got the poor fellow down on his back, and he got a straddle of the man's chest, and getting the turnkeys on the wrong tooth, he shut both eyes and pulled for his life. This is shucking and jiving to the extreme. He's pulling a tooth, put the guy down on him, straddles him, has some sort of vice, and is pulling out the wrong tooth. Oh my goodness. He got the poor fellow, I read that part. The poor man screamed as loud as he could, but to no purpose. Sam had him fast. After a great effort, out came the sound grinder, and the young doctor saw his mistake, but consoled himself with the idea that as the wrong tooth was out of the way, there was more room to get at the right one. Bleeding and a dose of calomel was always considered indispensable by the old boss, and as a matter of course, Sam followed in his footsteps. On one occasion, the old doctor was ill himself, so as to be unable to attend his patients. A slave, with pass in hand, called to receive medical advice, and the master told Sam to examine him and see what he wanted. This delighted him beyond measure, for although he had been acting his part in the way of giving out medicine as the master ordered it, he had never been called upon by the latter to examine a patient, and this seemed to convince him that, after all, he was no sham doctor. As might have been expected, he cut a rare figure. He cut a rare figure. That's just a phrase for him shucking and jiving for real, dancing around, doing who knows what. He cut a rare figure in his first examination, placing himself directly opposite his patient, and folding his arms across his breast and looking very knowingly, he began. That's what he looked like. What's the matter with you? I is sick. Where is you sick? Here, replied the man, putting his hand upon his stomach. Put out your tongue, continued the doctor. The man ran out his tongue at full length. Let me feel your pulse. At the same time, taking the patient's hand in his, placing his fingers on the pulse, he said, Ah, your case is a bad one. If I don't do something for you, and that pretty quick, you'll be a gone coon, and that's sartin. At this the man appeared frightened and inquired what was the matter with him. In answer, Sam said, I done told you that your case is a bad one, and that's enough. On Sam's returning to his master's bedside, the latter said, Well, Sam, what do you think is the matter with him? His stomach is out of order, sir, he replied. What do you think had best be done for him? I think I better bleed him and give him a dose of calomel, returned Sam. So to the latter's gratification, the master let him have his own way. We need not further say that the recital, we're calling it a recital, clearly a performance. I love William Wells Brown. We need not further say that the recital of Sam's experience as a physician gave him a high position amongst the servants that evening, and made him a decided favorite with the ladies, one of whom feigned illness when the black doctor, to the delight of all, and certainly to himself, gave medical advice. Thus ended the evening amongst the servants in the parson's kitchen. So in the midst of this minstrel show with Sam that we're getting is the story of a slave who needed some medical attention. And Brown writes, a slave with pass in hand called to receive medical advice. To be able to travel around off of their plantations or away from their masters, slaves needed to have passes so anybody who stopped them could see, yes, this is who you belong to. Yes, this is where you are allowed to be. And free black people also had to carry papers because they could get stopped at any point, and they needed to be able to prove that they were free. So this pass that allows you to move freely about from one situation to another is associated with the idea of racial passing. I think we talked about racial passing before, when people who self-identify, or who society identifies as one race, live, whether temporarily or permanently, as somebody of a different race. And that idea is called passing, in part because of this pass that slaves would have to carry that would allow them to move freely in between different situations. So a person who is racially passing is moving freely between races, like the pass. It also can refer to the euphemistic way of saying someone has died. They have passed. So a person who racially passes, their persona of the original race passes, it dies, and they pass into a new race. Important to keep note that the idea of a pass has been introduced here, and that it was introduced in the middle of a minstrel show. So at this moment, Brown has at least associated the idea of passing and minstrelsy right in this moment in his novel. That's particularly interesting to me because, I'm interested in these things, but I thought it was important to stop us for a moment and point that out. And that's where chapter 12 ends. And we are about to start chapter 13, but it's kind of long. Let's just stop for now. We'll call it a day. So that was chapter 12. We talked a lot about minstrelsy. We talked about racial passing. We talked about colorism. A lot happened for us in chapter 12. So I'm Rashonda Cade. This is Reading with Rashonda. Thanks for joining me.